From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to Face the State. Climate change is the most important challenge facing this and future generations. The consequences of a warming Earth are wide-ranging, complex, and difficult for the layperson to understand. Today, Chief Political Reporter Mike Dennison and I are joined by two professors at Montana State who recently authored the 2017 Montana Climate Assessment, a report to help Montana prepare for the effects of global warming on our landscape and on our economy. Cathy Whitlock is a professor of earth sciences and a former co-director of the Montana Institute of Ecosystems at MSU. Bruce Maxwell is a professor of agroecology and applied plant ecology at Montana State and the current co-director of the Montana Institute of Ecosystems. Doctors Whitlock and Maxwell, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the Montana Institute on Ecosystems and what is it, and then what's the genesis of the report that you folks put together here about the 2017 climate assessment? Dr. Whitlock.
Yeah, the Montana Institute on Ecosystems is a statewide institute of the Montana University system. So that means there's a hub at both U of M and a hub at MSU. And our goal is to bring together faculty that study different aspects of Montana's environment and try to work together on science and also get the message out to the broader public.
Okay. And the report? Yeah,
the Montana Climate Assessment has been a little over 2 years in the development, and it's a partnership with the Montana Institute on Ecosystems, the Montana Climate Office, and the Montana Water Center. But it also represents the work of researchers from both universities, from state and federal agencies, from tribal colleges, and from non-governmental organizations. And over the last years, we've spent a lot of time also going across the state and talking to stakeholders about what their interest is in climate change information and what kind of information they would like to get.
Bruce, let's kind of get into a little bit of the report and let's talk actual numbers on degrees. I mean, historically, we've already seen an annual temperature increase of maybe 2 to 3 degrees in the last few decades. First of all, what's the effect of that in Montana in terms of its economic sectors and just how we live our life and do our business here in Montana?
Well, it can have a major effect on a number of sectors. Clearly, agriculture is one of the primary ones that we focused on in this report. And we're looking at some crops perhaps not being, we won't be able to grow. Spring wheat, for example, is really challenged by the increase in number of days over 90 right during the period when it's trying to pollinate. That's a big issue. And so, and plant breeders are looking at it changing rapidly enough to be difficult to keep up with in terms of being able to adjust those varieties. Might have to have some varietal kinds of changes. There's, I could go on and on when we have, forests that will be challenged by drought. That could be a large issue. We can't grow wood as quickly. There's a whole range of things with water, of course. And so the warming temperatures are the really major compounding factor and that we're most confident about. So how it impacts a number of things is difficult to say.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We'll get into all of those, I think, in greater detail in the show. And one thing you didn't mention is tourism in Montana, which is a huge industry, kind of emerged a lot in the last couple of decades. I'm just wondering, in tourism going forward, if we're going to be warmer and possibly forest fires, whatever, what's your thoughts about the effects on tourism kind of going into the future?
Well, I'll start by saying we didn't address tourism directly in this report. In fact, that could be part of a future climate assessment. But clearly there's some things that'll have some impacts. Yeah. We're looking at warmer winters. The ski industry should be paying close attention as to what kinds of projections there are out there and the kinds of problems that could be associated with that. Keeping water in the rivers for fishermen is a big deal. Clearly clean air is if we have fires like we had this past summer, that's a big issue. Western Montana was encased in smoke for a big chunk of the summer. And so that will be a real challenge for us to think through, how do we deal with that? And that industry could be significantly affected.
We've already adapted to 2 or 3 degrees above what we're talking about in the 50s. What are some of those adaptations that have already occurred, Cathy, that we've already had to change in terms of behavior?
Some of the big changes in our system is we've seen reduction in snowpack, and that snow melts earlier.
Already?
Already.
Yeah.
Since 1950, there's been a really dramatic drop in that. And our ski industry has done reports already looking at the impacts of climate change, what it'll mean for their ski season, what it'll mean for snow conditions in the late season. We're seeing earlier stream runoff. Peak flow on streams is now about 2 weeks earlier now than it was in 1950. That has a big impact on water availability for farmers and the kinds of drought they may see late in the summer. So there's a lot of communities that are looking at things like flooding, early season flooding and late season drought, and forming watershed coalitions to come up with strategies for that. At the state level and the federal level, there's a big effort now to look at the Upper Missouri and how resilient the Upper Missouri watershed is to climate change. That's a federal and state partnership that involves nonprofits as well. And it's looking at efforts on how to better conserve water in the Upper Missouri and make plans for the future. So there's a lot of conversations that are going on and a lot of planning that's going on. People are taking note of what's been happening over the last few decades.
Go ahead.
Well, I'd add to that in that, just in the last 10 to 15 years, we started growing cantaloupes in Western Montana. That was never the case previous to about 10 years ago. We just would get too cold we'd have spring events that would frost out those kinds of crops. So now that we're seeing warming springs, we're getting a lengthened growing season, we can grow some of those things. So there are some positive benefits perhaps that come down the line like that. We're able to produce a greater spectrum of crops, and we've seen this particularly in the northeastern part of the state. So there's some positive benefits perhaps to having this longer growing season. What will challenge that is are we going to have the water into the later part of those seasons of those crops that are requiring irrigation to actually pull off those crops? So
let's talk about that water consequence. So right now we're focused on agriculture, but let's talk about the urban areas of the state. We're doing the show right now in Bozeman.
Yeah.
We rely upon reservoirs here to basically fuel the Bozeman urban area. What are the consequences that we've already seen from that 2 to 3 degree increase here in Bozeman? And the report says we might see temperatures rise as much as potentially 9 degrees by the time we get to the end of the century. What would that do to an urban area like Bozeman?
Well, clearly, we could be challenged for water, for our municipal water sources. And a lot of that comes from the fact that we're losing snowmelt earlier, and we don't have as much snowpack because we have warmer winters. So that is a real challenge in terms of maintaining the moisture that we'll have that regenerate that fill our groundwater and that we depend on a lot, not to mention the river and stream sources. So it'll be a challenge for a lot of communities in Montana with that.
One question I have is, we're going to talk a lot about the effects of climate change and global warming, but kind of an overarching thing that I wanted to have both of you address. I'll start with Cathy, and that is, in the academic community, people have studied this and know what's going on, but I think there's still a lot of doubters out there and skepticism about whether it's occurring and whether we can do anything about it. I'm just wondering, how do you address that within the academic community? It's pretty much accepted that this is going on. Is that correct? And I'm just wondering, is there anything you think that needs to be done to kind of convince people that, yes, this is true, this is happening?
Well, I think the scientific data are clear that the climate is warming and that humans are the primary cause of the climate warming that we've seen in the last century. So there's really not a debate in the climate community about that. But what we're finding as we go across the state, the most convincing information that we present is talking about the climate trends that have occurred, climate trends that have occurred since 1950s and over the last century. People understand that, and they've seen it, and they get it, and that's sort of ground that we can start talking about and start thinking about the future. So we find looking at the historical trends is a really good way that we can all get on the same page.
Okay. And what about you, Bruce? When you go talk to people across Montana, and you encounter someone who may have some doubts about this, I'm just wondering. First of all, I'm wondering if that does happen and how often it happens. And second of all, I'm wondering, how do you handle that in terms of saying, well, I think that it's pretty much settled.
I think there's been a big change in the last few years. I've talked to a lot of folks across Montana, and many of them agricultural folks. So they deal with climate directly. And the fact is, there's no convincing that needs to be done. They see it on a daily basis. I have had no one in the meetings that I've attended stand up and take exception to what we're saying in terms of the relationships perhaps that we base a lot of the projections on. CO2 concentration is increasing. That's increasing. We're getting a greater greenhouse effect. So I think that there's very little questioning of the actual case. Are we warming? And what does that mean? People really want to know, how do we deal with it? That's what I'm learning.
What I wanted to understand, and I went through the report, reading a lot of it, flipping through it. The one thing I think that surprised me was that we have a warming Earth, but Montana is going to warm perhaps even more than other areas in the United States. And I wanted to know why that's the case, because I didn't quite understand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was something we really hadn't thought about until we started doing the report. But so the temperature trends that you see are average. They're either average for the globe or the country or for Montana. And the reason that Montana has more warming than globally is because we're a long ways from the ocean. And the ocean has a very moderating effect on climate, as we all know. And so you're looking at a landmass that has no water bodies around it to sort of moderate the climate effects. And so the temperature increases are more extreme here than you'd see in Pacific Northwest or in other places.
One thing about the report that we think we understood, and we want to ask you about it, if we understood it correctly, and that is that you anticipate more total precipitation, but less in the summer. First of all, why more overall, and does that mean that we won't be just this dry state, it may become more humid in Montana? Explain to us what's going on there.
Yeah, I should start by saying that the report notes that the model projections for precip are with less certainty than the temperature. So precip's a much harder thing to model, to put in a climate model and get model agreement. But it does show that there is more precipitation in some seasons, like winter and spring, especially in most sectors of the state, is what we're finding. And the reason for that is when you have a warmer ocean, that atmosphere you have a warmer ocean and you have a warmer atmosphere, you can hold more water vapor, and so that delivers more precipitation to Montana. Most of our precip comes in spring and in winter, and so that's why those seasons get a little bit of a bump. It's because the atmosphere is warmer and it holds more water. And then you go into summer, where the temperatures are rising, and you basically shut off that precip, and so that's why summers get drier, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the summers will be drier, summers will be hotter, winters will be wetter, springs will be wetter.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, more wetting. The projections are there'll be more wetting in the spring and fall, but in the winter. But again, there's a great deal of uncertainty in those models capturing the conditions, especially when you have a place as mountainous as Montana or influenced by mountains. Once we get out onto the eastern edge of the state, we're probably a lot more confident about things.
Can you explain a little bit about the uncertainty in these models, and as much as you can for a layperson? I mean, I understand statistical uncertainty, but could you maybe tease out a little bit, so confidence intervals and kind of how you go about that?
Well, I can start with that. One of the things that I think we should point out is that we use 21 different models to make the projections, and they're come out of different places and different sort of logic behind them, although they share some common ideas or processes. They're physical-based models. But So what we tend to do is use those models as though they're replicate answers. In other words, we say that how much agreement is there among those models? We express that throughout the report in terms of what that agreement level is, and then put some certainty on that based on what the interpretations are out there in the scientific world of the outcomes of these models. And so the climate models have gone through quite an evolution of process of trying to decide how to present those kinds of results. And I think that's the simple answer to that question in terms of what our confidence is, and we tried to carry that through into the report in terms of this level of agreement among the models, and that gives you some sense for what those how much you can depend on those outcomes.
I'm also interested in terms of kind of the cyclical nature of a climate and weather. For instance, this year, when we had a fairly wet winter in spring, and then it just gets really hot, everything just dries out, it doesn't rain for like 2.5 months. I'm just wondering if you consider that to be an aberration, or is that moving toward a new normal that we can expect in the coming years?
Well, you can't take what happens in any given season as clear evidence of climate change. Mm-hmm. Climate is the average condition. So, but you can look at what happened this summer, where we had a wet winter and a wet spring, but the temperatures were warmer than normal, and they continued to be warmer than normal through the summer. And when that precipitation stopped at the end of the spring season, early summer, all we had was warmer temperatures and no precip. And so you shift from being a kind of a warm and wet condition to a warm and dry condition, and that's what moved us into this really pretty serious drought this year that affected most of the state, and it persisted, until the early fall. It's that shift when you turn off the precip, but you still have warm temperatures. You just transition, and I think that's, that's the kind of thing that's projected for the future.
Right, that's because I was going to say, it sounds like from your modeling is that it's going to get warmer, and it also may be it's going to be a little drier in the summer going forward, which is kind of what we had this year.
Yeah, I think this concept of flash drought that was thrown around a lot this summer was a good indication of the kinds of things that we really didn't anticipate. The extreme rapid drying that occurred, moving us into this condition that was a bit surprising, but July, on average, across Montana, we had 22 days over 90. That's significant.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And so, but that's on par with the projections. So it may be a forecast of the kinds of conditions that we're likely to see.
So one of the things we, of course, see here in Montana is, of course, eastern part of the state has much more greater range of temperatures, much more. So if anything, that's going to make eastern Montana even more severe and maybe more prone to these big grass fires that we saw this summer. Is that right?
I think in southeastern Montana in particular, where the drying effect is and this precipitation distribution projections, that's looking like one of the places that's going to suffer the most from these kinds of conditions. And yes, fires are very likely to increase, both forest and grassland. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's an interesting case though, because you have to have ignitions for fires as well. So and there were periods in the state this year where we didn't have as many ignitions as perhaps we've had in other years, but we had all the right things if we did get an ignition. So and Cathy can talk more about that.
And we've also seen really large floods in the last decade in eastern Montana, as well as droughts. And so all of these things get triggered by drier conditions following on a wet spring, I should say.
Let's go back to something Bruce mentioned at the beginning of the show. We talked about a lot of effects, and you mentioned forests, which we haven't talked that much about. I'm wondering, what are our forests going to look like 10, 20 years from now? And we had a kind of an epidemic of pine beetles in the last decade or so, and I'm just wondering, is that going to continue? And just what are those forests around the state going to look like in terms of being used for timber or being used for recreation or whatever we use the forest for? Lots of stuff.
I think I'll let Cathy start with that one.
Okay, well, our high elevation forests are the most vulnerable because as the climate warms, they're going to be forced higher and higher to higher elevations to find the suitable climate, and eventually they won't be able to find it. So a lot of people think that white bark pine is one of the most vulnerable conifers that we have in Montana. It's being affected by white pine blister rust, it's being affected by mountain pine beetle, and it's also getting clobbered by warmer temperatures. So the outlook for that doesn't look so good. The lower elevation trees are pretty adapted to drought, but these are also areas where there may be more fires, and so they're vulnerable in that respect. So you kind of ask, well, what's it going to look like in the future? We'll probably have more fires, and the likelihood of mountain pine beetles extending to higher elevations is greater because of the warmer temperatures. And so you're going to lose your fire-sensitive species. They'll become more restricted to little pockets, and you're going to get more of the trees that do well in fire, like lodgepole pine and mature Douglas fir and so on.
How about the outlook for timber harvest in these areas? How is this going to affect that?
Well, we don't address that in the report, really. But you can imagine fires are really the thing that really concern the timber industry now, so and pine beetle, so both of those will be factors.
Okay.
There's increasing evidence recently in the literature that's come out to indicate that climate is more of a driver perhaps than actually the condition of the forest, and that there's been observations that fires are burning regardless of the amount of logging, for example. So that background dry heat is really probably the biggest challenge for forests, and probably the better predictor for whether we have fire or not. It would take basically harvesting the entire forest to really reduce the effect of fire.
The hardest thing, and we talked a little about this before the show, about I like to think of climate as a tapestry, and you pull a string, and things start to unravel, maybe some things that you don't expect to unravel, but other things happen you may not expect. Let's go back to the white bark pine. All right, so we're going to have potentially fewer of them. What's the effect of having fewer white bark pine on the greater ecosystem? So what's the cascade effect? That, if you kind of tease that out a little bit.
Well, white bark pine is often called a keystone species, so it's like the keystone in an arch. When you take out that center stone, then the whole arch collapses, and white bark pine is considered that because it's the primary food for grizzly bears at high elevations. It's important food for red squirrels. Its seeds are dispersed and eaten by Clark's nutcrackers. So you start to take out that piece of your tapestry, and the ecosystem really changes and becomes something quite different.
What's hard, let me add to that. What's hard to predict about some of these pest effects, though, is the fact that we can see the effect on an individual life cycle, but what we don't know is how a lot of the other things respond at the same time. So there may be diseases that affect those pests that can be equally affected that we're not even aware of at this point in time because we haven't seen these conditions before. So some of those things are presenting themselves again in agricultural situations in particular, that even though we might see a particular pest that would benefit by a warmer temperature or a longer growing season, their predators or their pathogens are also going to increase. So hard to predict some of those kinds of outcomes, and gets at the complication of the ecosystem effect.
I understand with the keystone species of the white bark pine that one of the potential effects for the grizzly, if I understand this correctly, is that we're going to be more likely to see human-grizzly interactions because grizzly is going to be moving further down faster because of lack of food sources. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's the general thinking.
Okay.
I want to go back to agriculture a bit. Earlier, Bruce, you were talking about cantaloupe and you're talking about wheat and the effects of that. I'm just wondering, 20 years from now, we're going to have more frost-free days, probably a warmer climate. What types of crops do you see that we may be able to grow and which may be harmed? We grow a lot of crops in Montana. What's it going to look like?
Well, the one that we're already seeing, or a couple of shifts that we're already seeing are, for example, to winter wheat from spring wheat, because winter wheat then matures earlier in the spring into June, where we're not quite to the point where we're getting the heating. If we start getting heating back up into June, then we're going to be challenged even for winter wheat production. But that's just one case. I mean, there's a whole number of rotational kinds of crops, legumes in particular, like lentils, like peas, and those kinds of crops, that have been grown in parts of the state that have had warming and have had spring precipitation, like the northeast part of the state. And so that gives us great benefit, actually, to get that diversification into our agricultural
Yeah,
system.
that's actually been increasing, you said, mentioned along the High Line and their
Yes.
crops. Yeah.
Yes. We also are seeing an increase in corn and soybeans, the Midwestern kinds of crops, but they're moving into Montana. But there's a double thing going on there. We've had changes in varieties that have allowed them to work in a shorter growing season, but also the fact that those crops tend to be highly reliant on irrigation. So as we might attract from growing season point of view certain crops, we're also seeing that if those are attracted primarily in irrigated systems, then they could be really challenged. We might not get to use the end of that long growing season because we won't have the water.
So it compounds the stresses on the water.
Compounds.
So is it accurate to say, and actually I think it was last summer, I was driving over around Sydney, Montana, and I saw corn. That's new. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, it's
Relatively
not
new?
that. I mean, there's always been some corn, but it really has increased in recent years. And you know, it offers up, and there's a real economic advantage, of course, to growing corn when you can. So yeah, that's a crop that can fit well into the rotations, particularly with things like sugar beets, which have always been in Montana.
I've heard over and over again that Montana's wheat is of an exceptional quality relative to other wheat, and I know some of that's probably just Montana pride, but take that for what it's worth. If we shift to some of these drought-resistant wheat, how's it going to affect the quality of our wheat? And we got about 2 minutes left of the show, so.
Well, certainly we don't know the specific, let's say, response in terms of protein, for example.
Right.
We sell our wheat with a premium because of the protein content, and that's been a great thing for Montana. How our changes in temperatures and things will affect that is not entirely clear. There is some of the literature. Some recent paper came out, said that with increased CO2 concentrations, we're likely to get a decline in things like protein, the concentration of the things that we like to have, the nutritional value in our crops. And that's kind of across the board. Whether that affects wheat in our system is yet to be determined, I would say. But there are a few things that as you concentrate a crop like wheat, actually a little bit of drought can often increase the concentrations of those without going into the why that is. That's an example of something that can occur.
Very quickly, it's about a minute left, and we've been talking a lot about the troubling effects of climate change and global warming. Each of you, I'm just wondering, is there any potential economic winners or benefits here as they go into the future? Anything come to mind really quickly?
It's a bit quick, yeah.
There is with me. I mean, the market garden industry has really increased, particularly in western Montana. A longer growing season, as long as they have water, is going to open up a greater spectrum of crops to sell at farmers markets and things like that.
Well, thank you both for joining us to talk about climate change. It's a nettlesome issue, it's a complicated issue, but it's certainly something that we have to address here in Montana. There has been chatter in the political classes about having a special session up in Helena. We might be having one, and if so, Mike and I will come back to talk about what to expect from that special session and the results of that session. So stay tuned over the next month to us here on Face the State. Thanks for joining us today.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.